Today, we're very pleased to have Department Chair Ricardo Dominguez take us on a tour of the Department of Visual Arts. Ricardo Dominguez was a founding member of the Critical Art Ensemble and a co-founder of the Electronic Disturbance Theater 1.0, a group who developed virtual sit-in technologies in solidarity with the Zapatista communities in Chiapas, Mexico in 1998. His recent Electronic Disturbance Theater 2.0 lab project, the Transborder Immigrant Tool, was the winner of the Transnational Communities Award in 2008, an award funded by Cultural Contact, Endowment for Cultural Mexico, US, and handed out by the US Embassy in Mexico. It was also funded by Cal IT Squared and the UCSD Center for the Humanities. The Transborder Immigrant Tool has been exhibited at the 2010 California Biennial, the Toronto Free Gallery in Canada, as well as at several other national and international venues. The Transborder Immigrant Tool was also under investigation by the US Congress, the FBI, the Homeland Security Department, UCSD and UCOP in 2009 and 2010, and was reviewed by Glenn Beck in 2010 as a gesture that potentially dissolved the US border with its US poetry. Dominguez is an associate professor at the University of California, San Diego in the Visual Arts Department, a Hellman Fellow, and a principal investigator at Cal IT Squared. He took part in a video series entitled An Oral History of the Internet for the New York Art Gallery, and Ricardo is also chair of the Department of Visual Arts. Let's welcome now Department Chair.
Hello. Thank you, Suzanne. It's a pleasure to be here, and hopefully I will be able to give you a sense of the work that I have done, because it is part and parcel of the history of the Department of Visual Arts here at University of San Diego, University of California, San Diego, that has a long, rich history in investigating arts and technology, arts and computing, as well as a long and rich history of arts and border culture and artivism, that is art and activism. And certainly my work represents one of the formations that is part of the conversation in the Department of Visual Arts that ranges from painting to sculpture, to film, to synthetic biology, to artificial intelligence, to do-it-yourself speculative fiction, to speculative design, to urban design and architecture, to public culture, to electronic music, to art history. So it is wide-ranging in its territories, and I am part of the computing arts section of the department. As I was introduced, I am an associate professor as well as chair of the visual arts, a principal investigator at Cal IT2, now known as the Qualcomm Institute. I have worked throughout my last 40 years as a collaborative co-creator of multiple different groups, such as Critical Art Ensemble, Electronic Disturbance Theater, Bang Lab, or Bits, Atoms, Neurons, and Genes, as well as the Particle Group that has focused specifically on nanopoetics and nanotoxicology. So I'm just going to give you an analysis or a trajectory of my own work and research and practice. And I think it can elucidate the multiple ways that it touches in the history of the Department of Visual Arts. So like Charles Dickens, I am going to start at the beginning of life. I am born, but I am born in flight. That is, I'm going to look at 5 ways of art flight, aesthetic flight, that have been part of my development as an artist. Flight 1, micro gestures. I was born in El Paso, Texas, at the border of Juarez, Mexico, and the US. Now, at the age of about 6 months, my family moved to fabulous Las Vegas, Nevada. And so it's really there that I grew up and gained consciousness. My family moved to Las Vegas very early in the early to mid 50s. And so, as many of you know, Las Vegas is part of the larger state of Nevada, which is 98% military. Very little of it is civilian. And that is civil society is Las Vegas, Carson City, the state capital, in Reno, Nevada, and a lot of little towns, but mostly it is Area 51, where supposedly they keep the aliens, Nellis Air Force, an area in which experimental training, especially around new types of flight, like the X-15 and the F-15 that was being developed when I was growing up, as well as 100 miles north, the Nevada nuclear test site. So I grew up watching nuclear bombs go off above ground and below ground. Here I am with my mother looking at the nuclear bomb going off. At school, we were told it was part of a tradition to protect the nation. It was during the Cold War. And so, like many other children, I thought that this beautiful mushroom cloud going into the sky was a protective force field, if you will, around our nation. And it was to a certain extent. But when I was born, my father gave me a black and white RCA portable television, which probably weighed more than all of UCSD put together. It had little glowing tubes, as you might remember. But when I turned on my portable RCA black and white television, what I saw were these old films that were being shown, and that is that monsters would be produced by these nuclear bombs. Monsters would be produced in this desert of radiation that would grow to an enormous size and basically begin to attack my very home. Here is a poor man who encounters a nuclear bomb and is turned into a giant. He begins to destroy the casinos there in Las Vegas, Nevada. The Sands starts to attack Danny Thomas. So there was a kind of sense that there was something different happening in terms of the way nuclear weapons, radiation was being read and presented at school as part of a patriotic social force field. And what my little black and white television set was telling me was the production of monsters because of these nuclear bombs. So it was that tension that really led to my critical consciousness of slowly becoming an activist or an artist activist, an artivist. As a young person in the 60s and 70s, I became very interested in the ecological movement, participating in the first Earth Day, participating in actions against shutting down the nuclear test sites. And so I became very interested in agitprop theater. I also became very interested in classical theater. In the 70s, I was trained in Aeschylean theater, Greek drama, Elizabethan theater, Shakespeare, and contemporary theater from Beckett to Chekhov to Bertolt Brecht, as well as Chicana theater of the Teatro Campesino. And so I had all these elements at play. And I also was very interested in performance art and body art. In Las Vegas, I didn't really see a lot of body art or performance art, but I read about it. And this was the work of artists like Vito Anconci and Marina Abramovic. And so by the end of the 70s, I was trying to think about what it meant to do work that was about body art, that was about classical Greek theater, the emergence of democratic values that were part of that culture, as well as activist theater in terms of street theater or agitprop theater. And by the end of the 70s, I had found that I felt I needed to do something else. And so I got an old Polaris car and decided to drive to Miami. I'm not sure what was interesting in Miami. I just thought it would be something to do. And as I was driving towards Miami, my car broke down in Tallahassee, Florida, northernmost Florida, almost Georgia, 20 minutes away in terms of flora and fauna. And I broke down in front of a lesbian bookstore called Ruby Fruit Books, named after Rita Mae Brown's famous lesbian novel, Ruby Fruit Jungle. And they were kind enough to lend me their telephone so I could call my family back in Las Vegas and let them know my car had broken down and where I was. And they said, "Hey, do you want to work here? We need somebody who can sell books." And I said, "Yeah, I love books. I love reading. I'd be happy to do that." So I started becoming a book buyer at the bookstore. And at that time, in 1980, 81, there was all sorts of interesting work emerging in different communities that I wasn't fully cognizant of, but certainly as a book buyer, I was seeking new works to sell to the community and share with the community. And among this was post-structuralist theory, what was European philosophy or continental philosophy. I was very interested in science fiction. I was interested in minority fiction, such as lesbian fiction. And so there I started meeting other community in Tallahassee, Florida. And among them were a number of young artists as well. And here you see the beginning of this group that formed in the early 80s called Critical Art Ensemble. There, the gentleman with the mustache, Steve Barnes, was the first person I ever met who worked with computers, and he hated computers. And next to him was Dorian Burr, a photographer, and guess what? She hated photography. And I was there in the middle, somebody who had been trained in the theater, and I hated theater. And next to me is Hope Kurtz, a poet, and guess what? She hated poetry. And next to her is Steve Kurtz, a filmmaker, and he hated film. So you could see there was a theme. We quit working in the territories of our interest, and we began to think that we needed to add something to our art practices. And this was through a kind of negative dialectics, that is, by not mobilizing what we love, but developing something else. And at that time, we began to investigate the ideas around the digital and the cybernetic. We began to explore ideas of cyberspace that were emerging mainly in science fiction in the 1980s. And at that time, we established different ways of working. One of them was to create the poetry based on what we called utopian plagiarism. And this was to make handmade books that would take an idea and we would add another idea, cut and paste, if you will. And so, for instance, we were reading Henry David Thoreau's 1848 book on civil disobedience, his protest against the expansion of the slave states into Mexico and the Mexican-American War. And we used this poetic device of utopian plagiarism by adding electronic to on civil disobedience. And so there we had electronic civil disobedience. So in the early 80s, we thought this would be an interesting response poetically to the emergence of the concept of cyberspace, and to begin to think about what sort of gestures could be made, such as electronic civil disobedience. The other thing that I did was to explore what was a new territory in the 1980s, and that was mall culture. Malls were just emerging, at least in northern Florida at that time. And it seemed to us that malls were really kind of simulations of public agora, public space. They just pretended to be a public space, but you were only really allowed to buy things there. So I started developing what are called micro gestures. And these were gestures that allowed community to gather and discussed what a space was about, what was lurking in that space. So with $20, I went into the mall. And instead of being a good commodity fetishist and taking my commodities home and breaking them out there, I just broke them out at the edge of the mall. I wasn't blocking the mall. I wasn't protesting. I was just playing with my commodities. And very soon, community would gather, security would come. They would ask, is this a houseless person, a Vietnam vet, somebody with disabilities that didn't understand what to do with their commodities? And this gesture allowed then a disturbance to take place without necessarily having to compose what the disturbance was about. And it's a gesture that has happened and explored over the years. So utopian plagiarism and these micro disturbances were important to us. Well, by the mid 80s and towards the end of the 80s, a new pandemic began to emerge called HIV/AIDS. Nobody knew what it was originally, and it was attached to homosexual or queer culture. And many of our friends began to die. And the president at that time, Ronald Reagan, didn't seem to care that the community was dying. And of course, as we know, the HIV/AIDS pandemic was going to go far beyond the gay or queer community. But Critical Art Ensemble, as we were known now, began to do cultural vaccine projects where we would invite community in Tallahassee to share their thoughts on this kind of hysteria of contagion. Right at that time, if you saw a gay person on TV, suddenly you too could have HIV and AIDS. It was so hysterical. And so we started doing cultural vaccine projects, and we started ACT UP Tallahassee, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which was focused on getting Fauci, Dr. Fauci, who was new at that time at NIH, to really start supporting research into what HIV/AIDS was. And part of this was to establish community science practices and working with a community that was dying of AIDS, who were chemists and biologists there at universities, Florida State University specifically, start developing practices that could help our communities somehow get the treatments they needed by getting on the boards of pharmaceuticals, getting on the boards of NIH to promote testing, to promote new methods of cure. And so this was really letting our theories hit the ground. And part of this ACT UP was to protest. And so we started using electronic civil disobedience that we had developed poetically by doing fax jams or call jams, where we would call pharmaceuticals or the NIH or CDC and demand by the sheer communication that they investigate what HIV and AIDS was and how best to approach a potential cure. Blood was a very dangerous territory at that time. So I was doing blood performances around testing at that time, a call to cure AIDS, if you will, similar to a pandemic that we are under now, if you will. Out of this research came a book that we wrote called Electronic Disturbance, where we began to bring together our ideas around three things that were occurring in the 80s, not just electronic civil disobedience, but we began to explore the way genomic culture, the Human Genome Project started in the 80s, was going to lead towards what we would call clone capitalism or genetically driven capitalism. We wanted to investigate what that would mean if companies began to own certain kind of genetic lines. And the third area of focus in the 80s was around nanotechnology. We were following the work of K. Eric Drexler around the new protocols for nanotechnology, and we were fascinated by the potentials of particle capitalism. What if organizations or corporations would begin to use nanotechnology for the ownership of almost quantum level organizing of matter? And so this book was published in 1984, even though it was written in 1994, even though it was written in the 80s. This was followed by a book called Electronic Civil Disobedience and Other Unpopular Ideas that was published in 1995. At the end of the 80s, I decided to leave for New York City, taking the idea of electronic civil disobedience, and I wanted to establish a way to organize computers to help me do research. In the 80s in Tallahassee, Florida, we didn't have computers. So I went to New York City looking for computer access, and I found it with a group of artists who started an internet service provider, ISP, sort of like AOL at that time. It was called Thing.net, and it was started by an artist named Wolfgang Stahler, a painter, and it was an internet service provider that by 1992, we had servers in Berlin, we had servers in Argentina, we had servers in Denmark, we had servers all around the world by the end of 1993. It was called The Thing, and I became a system administrator, learning hands-on how to code and develop infrastructure for computers and computing. One of the areas I started doing when I got to New York City in 1991, as I started working at Thing.net, was to read the work of the RAND Corporation. As you know, the RAND Corporation is the leading military think tank. And in 1991, Runfelt and Aquila wrote an essay called Cyber War is Coming, where they defined cyber terrorism, cyber war, and cybercrime, and the economies of cybersecurity that would be forthcoming once these things were established. It was kind of a dream of cybersecurity economies. And one thing that I found interesting about this essay by the RAND Corporation in 1991 was they never mentioned electronic civil disobedience. So I thought it would be interesting to establish a dialogue with the RAND Corporation. But the other thing I thought was that electronic civil disobedience should be connected to cyber poetics or the practices of art. Then in 1994, three things happened that really radically changed everything. As you might remember, in April of 1993, the first browser was created. All of you probably use browsers, but the very first one, Mosaic, came out. And this was really revolutionary. Up to that point, people really didn't have a simple way to access cyberspace or the digital space. And browsers created links, hot links, the ability to put up text and images. The second thing that happened was that NAFTA, at 1 minute after midnight, 1994, the free trade agreement between Canada, the US, and Mexico was signed at midnight, 1994. So there was browsers, there was NAFTA. And at that same moment in 1994, at 1 minute after midnight, the Zapatistas, an indigenous community in southernmost Chiapas, emerged and said no to NAFTA that would eliminate indigenous rights that Mexico had granted back in the Mexican Revolution to the indigenous community. So at 1 minute after midnight, they ripped into the electronic fabric. And the next day, the New York Times called them the first postmodern revolution. What was fascinating about the Zapatistas was they didn't have telephones, they didn't have computers, they barely had electricity. They did not speak Spanish as the predominant language, but they immediately understood that cyberspace was a way to communicate with the world. And within 6 hours, they created the Zapatistas in Cyberspace movement that I joined that night. I started working with the Zapatistas, establishing a network. They met with me in New York City, and working with the Zapatistas, I established the way electronic civil disobedience would work. It would be both on the ground. Here I am protesting in front of the Mexican consulate to support the Zapatistas. And I started developing web browser or web-paged information sites. And so I'm going to show you a little bit of a video about this particular moment. Hold on. Just give me a moment to bring up the video. Hopefully you can hear it.
It was in the hills of Chiapas in 1994 that the first shots were fired in the information war. Despite being without phones or electricity, Mexico's Zapatista rebels took the revolution online, issuing a call to arms across the internet for others to join them in a worldwide struggle against economic imperialism. Ricardo Dominguez and his electronic Disturbance theatre were among the first to heed the call.
When I came to New York in 1991, what I was looking for was a platform that would allow me to create a space for electronic civil disobedience.
Ricardo Dominguez, Electronic Disturbance Theatre, New York. Digital Zapatista.
Electronic civil disobedience is non-violent direct action online. It follows the theory of Thoreau in On Civil Disobedience that was then developed by Gandhi, Martin Luther King, ACT UP during the 80s, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. We never destroy a server. We never change anybody's web page. We never hijack their name or domain name.
In 1998, Electronic Disturbance Theater releases FloodNet, the first automated virtual sit-in software with actions against the Mexican president's website, several Mexican banks, Frankfurt Stock Exchange, and even tries attacking the Pentagon. At one point, the Pentagon fires back with hostile Java applets, crashing the attacker's system.
By creating the idea of electronic disturbance, Ricardo found a way to mix his passion for politics and performance with a dash of magic realism and turn it into code.
Really, what is a Zapatista is those who can take into their heart the poetic gestures. The gestures of information war, which cross the boundaries of what is. For instance, on January 3rd, 2000, newspapers around the world had Zapatista Air Force attacks Mexican military. Nobody knew the Zapatistas even had planes. Nobody even knew the Zapatistas could fly. But if you read the story, suddenly you discover that these Zapatista Air Force were paper airplanes made of many different colors. Inside were messages of peace. So what the soldiers were shooting at were these paper airplanes. And there you have this enactment of a simulation, of a gesture which creates this magical space where indeed there does exist a Zapatista Air Force. Because what you're trying to get out is what the Zapatistas say is information war. That is, words as war, not words for war.
Inspired by the Zapatistas' ideas, Ricardo and his crew launched their FloodNet tool as the paper aeroplane of cyberspace.
So I'll stop the video there and bring up the slides here in a moment. Bear with me. Electronic civil disobedience became part of the digital Zapatista movement. At the same time as I was developing these virtual sit-ins, I was working with another group of artists called Fake Shop in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, where we used early See You, See Me video, which came out of Cornell University, similar to Zoom, only far worse. It was the size of a postage stamp. You couldn't really hear anybody, but it was a really interesting platform. So I used that, and here you can see part of the way See You, See Me worked with Fake Shop. We were interested in 1970 movies like Coma, and Coma, they harvest the organs of young people. And so we were doing a similar thing using the internet and See You, See Me. I took this idea and started developing digital Zapatista gatherings at MIT because MIT had invited me to develop a performance that would last a year called Rabin Alaki Zapatista Port Action. Rabin Alaki is a Mayan play. It was a way to establish ways of new communication systems for digital Zapatismo. Here is Electronic Disturbance Theater. There with the beard and mustache is Stephen Ray, a scholar on information war, graduated with his PhD from University of Texas at Austin. I had read his dissertation and became really fascinated by the ideas. Next to him is Carmen Karasik, a leading MIT technologist and bug hunter. That is, if there's a problem with your code, she will find it and fix it. Then myself, and then to the other side, where you see a gentleman with glasses, is Brett Stalbaum, a professor at UCSD. At that time, he was a young net artist at here in California. And so we started the Electronic Disturbance Theater. This is the way the Zapatista FloodNet worked. You could upload 404 files or files not found into systems like Justice. We would ask the Mexican government website, does Justice exist in your system? And the Mexican government website will respond, 404 file, justice not found. So we weren't hacking into a system. We weren't breaking into a system. We were just letting you know that justice, democracy, and rights didn't even exist in the system. 404 files are part of the public agora of browsers. We were invited by Ars Electronica, the biggest arts and electronic culture gathering in Linz, Austria. It was called Information War. And that's where we started telling stories, Mayan technology stories about electronic civil disobedience. And this became part of a larger condition called hacktivism. In 2000, I entered another line of flight. We might call this delaying deportation flights in 2001. Electronic Disturbance Theater was contacted by a group of artists in Cologne, Germany, no border communities in Germany, 68 no prison communities, to stop the German government from using Lufthansa, a private airline, to deport people. What they would do is they would mummify immigrants and refugees into public Lufthansa flights, mummify them, and put motorcycle masks on top of their heads. And this then allowed them from being heard. But a lot of the people who were being removed were young women and young men, and the mask asphyxiated them. So they died in quite a large numbers. So they asked Electronic Disturbance Theater to come help them with electronic civil disobedience against Lufthansa. We went around Germany and we did a lot of information for a month, telling people what was happening, why we were doing it, how electronic civil disobedience worked. It's all very transparent. We never hide our data bodies or real bodies. That is, you always know it's Ricardo Dominguez doing this. You always know it's us. Our data bodies and real bodies are one. The code is not secret. We always let you know what's going to happen. We dressed like Lufthansa people and handed out information. We told people how to go online and take down the Lufthansa site. At the end of the action, the Lufthansa site went down. The stockholders were meeting and they said they would never do another deportation flight. The pilots union said they signed a paper. Well, they signed a paper saying that their union would never allow another deportation site, and the stewards also signed it. We were then taken to court as cyber terrorists in Frankfurt. We were going to go to jail for 10 years, or fined up to something like 50,000 euros or something. But then the higher court of Frankfurt overturned the case, said that electronic civil disobedience was part of a civil right of German and EU individuals. So that's the only court case we've ever had around electronic civil disobedience, but we won as a right. It wasn't cyber terrorism, wasn't cyber crime, it wasn't cyber war. It was electronic civil disobedience and a social right. So when I was hired in 2004 here at UCSD, I presented that I would do 4 things at UCSD. I would continue to explore hacktivism using the supercomputers of UCSD against corporations, communities, and even the university itself, if need be, around questions that we thought were important. The other would be to develop border technology disturbance tools. I didn't know exactly what that would be, but I would explore it. The other is I would start working with Nano3 on nanotoxicology and nanopoetics. This was the first microgesture I did here at UCSD. I went to the US border and Mexico-US border. I'd never been at the border before. I was born at the border, but I never lived there. And I had my UCSD shirt on, looking at the Pacific Rim, beautiful. And then the Border Patrol came really quickly and told me I cannot stand at the border. I cannot be happy. I must be sad. Walk on. So I could tell it was going to be pretty easy to disturb the border. I then created another group with Professor Stalbaum here in the Department of Visual Arts. You see him in the green. He is also a founder of Electronic Disturbance Theater 1.0 that created electronic civil disobedience. Next to him, with the colorful rainbow nylons or socks, is Professor Amy Carroll, who's a professor in the Lit department here at UCSD, an experimental poet and scholar of border arts. Behind me is Ellie Mermad, a sound artist and mixed reality artist, an MFA at that time. And next to her is transmedia artist and trans artist, Misha Cardenas, my very first MFA. And there I am. We started Electronic Disturbance 2.0, and we developed the Transporter Immigrant Tool, working with NGOs in the Anza Borrego area in southernmost California who leave water, Water Station Inc. and Border Angels. The tool was very simple. It was a simple AI that would direct you to the nearest water as you were crossing the desert highway, because you can get lost and dehydrated. It also had poetry that gave you sustenance. That is, did you know that the water cactus, barrel cactus, always points north? The poet used military survival manuals to develop the poetry. It was in multiple languages, and this is an ad that we had in the newspaper about how the tool worked in Spanish. The FBI, Fox News, like Glenn Beck, the University of California, San Diego, and UCOP, University of California, Office of the President, as well as congressional members like Darrell Hunter and others got very angry that this tool existed, and they began an investigation. After 3 years, they lost. UCSD tried to detenure me. UCOP tried to detenure me. Congress tried to, I guess, accuse me of being a traitor to the nation, and the FBI of cyber terrorism, but they lost the case because it wasn't any of that. It was geopoetic system. I'll finish here. One of the things I have to do is teach Photoshop to my students. And as you might know, our university is at the center of Drone Valley. We developed a lot of the technology with General Atomics and others for this $50 billion unmanned aerial vehicle production zone that we are part of. And as you know, the Predator drone, the most famous, is used for signature strikes in the Middle East, but also Homeland Security uses these systems. So using Photoshop, we developed notes that we put around campus to alert people about drones at home. Then a drone crashed over by the Dr. Seuss library. I was made the head of the Center for Drone Policy and Ethics by the Chancellor to investigate these cases. And the last project I'm working on is the Palindrome, which is a Predator drone, or a copy of it, about a third of the size, that will fly along the US-Mexico border and sing to Homeland Security drones the culture of the border, the voices, the music, the poetry of the border. So that's where I'll end in terms of projects, but that gives you a sense of how the Department of Visual Arts historically has worked with technology, border activism, expanding the question of what art is, what art can do, and what are the different levels of the canvas and sculpture and public presence of art. Thank you for your time and attention, and I can have some questions if you wish.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor Dominguez. That was really an interesting presentation and somewhat unexpected. I had no idea that this kind of work was happening in the Department of Visual Arts. It was very exciting. Do you see the work of Anonymous and other such activists as part of the electronic activism that you were really at the beginning of?
Yes, there is connections. I suppose that the big difference is that when we established electronic civil disobedience in the 80s and 90s, it was around what we would call a transparent aesthetics. That is, we wanted to make sure that like any activist in the streets, the police could come, they could arrest us, they knew who we were, that there was no secret, it was all transparent. Gandhi had said that in order to enact nonviolent action, you have to have sayagraha. Your body has to be present for those to see and hear you. So transparency was a key thing, a key aesthetic. With anonymous, it's anonymous, right? It's the group functions both in a way that you don't know who they are. Their technology is not one that creates a disturbance, but is very effective. It is a technology that can literally take down sites or crack into sites. This doesn't mean I don't disagree with many of the sort of core concerns of Anonymous. They're doing stuff right now around the Ukrainian war and the attack on Ukraine. They've done a lot of actions that I haven't agreed with, but for the most part, I think they do carry a kind of ethics, even if it's not exactly the territory of electronic disturbance theater. Another difference is that electronic disturbance theater was a group of artists. The gestures were developed as part of a social sculpture, a public sculpture of art. Anonymous is mainly individuals who function within the matrix of technology and use technology in anonymous and very direct and robust ways. I don't know if that answers the question as to some of the differences, but also perhaps an expansion of civil disobedience.
Yes, I have two more questions for you, if you don't mind.
No.
I'd like to know the project with leaving water and that tool, is that still functional?
Well, it was functional. What happened was that in 2007, UCSD gave me $5,000 to work on developing the tool. And the core idea was that it would have poetry, that it would move from a global positioning system to a geopoetic system. We were working with NGOs out in the Anza Borrego area. It all was going really quite well until Congress at Darrell Issa and Duncan Hunter and others became aware of the tool and started this whole kind of actions against the tool, which led to about 3 years of legal stuff. So by the time of 2011, when we were ready to give the tool out, the narcos who became owners, if you will, of the informal economies that would help refugees and immigrants cross or help them pretend or move forward into the US. And it became apparent that if we were to give individuals this phone, they could be killed, right, just for having it, because the narcos don't take kindly to people having that kind of power. So we felt really that we could not move forward with the project. We had to rethink it. What has happened is that another group in Europe took on the project. As you know, the Mediterranean is a giant site for immigration, and there is a border system there called Frontex, and they often let boats sink rather than help them. So now the transporter immigrant tool is called the alarm phone. And what people do is something is happening. They can call and use this system, and artivists and activists can have boats out on the Mediterranean who can find them and help them and support them. So that is where it's being used now. So it's a shift of territories, but a similar quality. Does that
I've
answer?
read about that program, and I think that's really exciting that initiated with your project.
Mm-hmm.
Then I'd like to know, is electronic disturbance being taught in the visual arts department?
Yes, the histories of one of the things that I want to make clear is the Department of Visual Arts has a long history of border art. That is, long before I came, there were artists like Lewis Hawk, Professor De Silva, who established major festivals and practices around border art. Probably the most famous is something called the Insight Festival, that started in the 90s and went up into the mid 2000s. And this was a border art festival that created hundreds of border art practice and art practices that were always disturbing the border. And the UCSD, if you go to the library, hosts the archive of the Insight Border Arts Festival. So when we teach art history, when we teach technology, it's always within the question of border arts. That's one level. In terms of the computing arts, we do teach the history of hacktivism. We teach the history of electronic civil disobedience. And right now, many of our young faculty are working around artificial intelligence and machine learning. So they add a new level of artivism to these new endeavors and technologies. So it continues to be taught on multiple levels.
Excellent. I'd just like to make sure it doesn't stop at your, with your generation.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Members, are there any other questions? There was a comment in the chat for you.
Oh, is there any way that we retirees could learn from you and experience your teaching, mentorship, and knowledge? Well, I'm always happy to teach people on how to use the electronic civil disobedience system. It's fairly simple. I can certainly share with anybody who's interested how to look at the code. It's very simple code. It's called HTML or Hypertext Markup Language. And I can certainly offer you history or access to books, which are PDFs that can give you and elucidate the history and present, as well as the direct practices of electronic civil disobedience. And you can reach out to me. I think Suzanne has my email.
Yes. Yes.
Which is, and you can find me at the UCSD Department of Visual Arts website. And contact me. Of course, I'm now chair of the department, so that keeps me, really busy in ways I never expected. But I'm more than happy to share resources, thought, documentaries, or anything that might be of interest to you, Bev.
Professor Dominguez, this was really a fabulous presentation. Very, very interesting. We thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate it. And I hope you guys have a really wonderful day.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.